They say beneath the marble floors of St. Peter's Basilica, there lies more than saints and bones. There are doors without handles, corridors that curve into darkness, and rooms where the air feels heavy as if thick with unspoken prayers. But what if the silence hides something older than the church itself? What if locked behind Vatican stone rest the very relics the Knights Templar died to protect? Relics seized, catalogued, and buried beneath the symbol of divine authority. The world saw their ashes burn in 1314. But their secrets perhaps never left Rome. You picture it now, the echo of footsteps fading beneath candlelight, the smell of old paper, and the weight of centuries pressing down on a single locked door. The story you are about to hear begins not with faith or betrayal, but with disappearance. History remembers the Knights Templar as warriors of Christ, protectors of pilgrims, and eventual heretics, accused, tortured, and erased. Yet between those brutal headlines lies an absence, a gap in records so deliberate it hums with intent. When Pope Clement V dissolved the order under the pressure of King Philip IV, their fortresses were emptied, their coffers stripped, their relics seized. But no one could account for what was taken next. Rumors spoke of a hidden convoy bound for the papal chamber's crates, sealed with red wax and guarded by priests in armor. The church called it confiscation. The survivors called it theft. And centuries later, within the Vatican's most forbidden archives, there remain references, single lines, partial inventories to objects secured from the temple. Not destroyed, secured. That single word changes everything. Because if those relics survived, if they were indeed transported under papal authority, then the Vatican is not just a witness to Templar history. It is its final custodian. Tonight we'll follow that trail from the night the Templars fell to the vaults beneath St. Peter's. We'll trace what was taken, why it was hidden, and what it might mean for the Church's oldest secret. You may find that history's silence isn't accidental, it's engineered. Before we venture further into the shadows, take a moment to subscribe so you never miss a secret that history has tried to forget. It began not with thunder or the voice of God, but with whispers, soft, bureaucratic, and deadly. On the night of October 13, 1307, as Paris slept under a veil of mist, hundreds of papal letters were opened by candlelight. Inside, the same words echoed across Europe: arrest every Templar. At dawn, armored boots thundered through cloisters, and one of the most powerful orders in Christendom was erased in a single morning. You can almost hear the iron hinges of the temple fortress groaning as they were forced open, the smell of damp parchment, and the terrified murmur of monks clutching relics that would never again see daylight. By sunrise, King Philip IV had achieved what crusaders and caliphs never could. He broke the temple. But he hadn't done it alone. Behind him stood the invisible hand of Pope Clement V, whose seal authorized the arrests in the name of the Church. In the official chronicles, it was called purification, the cleansing of heresy. In reality, it was a heist cloaked in righteousness. Within hours, Templar treasuries from Paris to Poitiers were seized. Gold, of course, but also relics, chalices sealed, reliquaries, ornate boxes of carved cedar rumored to contain fragments of the true cross. And something else, items no inventory dared to name. Contemporary records describe a curious precision in the raids. Certain rooms were entered before others, as if the captains already knew where the most valuable things lay. Some documents suggest they were accompanied by clerics, men fluent in Latin inventories, not soldiers. It was less an ambush than an audit. And when the knights were dragged away in chains, they were not asked about gold or swords, but about the head, the kiss, the idol. Questions that spoke not of crime, but of possession. The Vatican's role, though shrouded in papal language, reveals itself between the lines. Clement's orders reached France through ecclesiastical couriers, not royal messengers. He insisted the seized relics be kept safe for the faith, a phrase that conveniently justified their removal to church custody. Some were said to have been sent to Avignon, where the papal court had relocated under guard by Dominican friars. Others vanished completely. The temple's treasure house in Paris, a fortress within a fortress, yielded nothing of note when royal accountants finally tallied it. It was as if someone had emptied it before dawn. And perhaps someone had. The disappearance of Templar relics would ripple through European rumor for generations. Chroniclers whispered of secret carts moving under moonlight heading south toward papal lands. One account by a royal clerk claimed to have seen sealed chests of gilded wood loaded upon 6 mules bound for the Rhone. Another noted that the papal nuncio overseeing the arrests left Paris the next morning, his convoy conspicuously heavy. None of this reached the official trial records, of course. Those were carefully curated for theology, not theft. What makes that morning so strange is not merely what was taken, but what was left. The Templars' libraries were sacked, yet a few manuscripts survived in local monasteries, mostly inventories and land grants. In their margins, faint ink notations hint at relics of our Lord, and the vessel of holy unction references crossed out by later hands. It was as though scribes had been ordered to forget. Yet forgetting, when commanded, leaves its own scars. Centuries later, when Vatican archivists began recataloguing confiscated medieval property, they found an odd gap, a missing set of acquisition lists from 1308 to 1312. Every other decade was intact. One archivist, a Jesuit scholar in the 1890s, noted in his private journal that some inventories appear to have been rewritten in the same hand, though dated decades apart. He was quietly reassigned to Malta before finishing the project. The Vatican never explained why. Historians still debate whether the arrests were driven by greed or fear. Some argue Philip needed money to fund wars. Others claim Clement feared the Templars' growing independence. But the coordination, the precision, the selectivity, these point to something far older than politics. It feels ritualistic, as though a script was being followed, written centuries before, by those who knew that power does not reside in crowns or coins, but in what people believe you own. And somewhere under the marble calm of Rome, that ownership still lingers. You can almost imagine a vault door that has not been opened in 700 years, its hinges sealed with the wax of both king and pope. What lies behind it may never be displayed in glass or mentioned in sermons, but it is there waiting, humming quietly beneath the feet of pilgrims who will never know what they walk upon. The night the Templars fell was not the end of their relics. It was their relocation. You might have assumed the betrayal came from outside, from a greedy king perhaps, or a suspicious nobility eager to dismantle the wealthiest order in Christendom. But the blade that severed the Templars from their legacy came not from the throne, but the altar. Pope Clement V, God's vicar on earth, was not merely a passive observer in their downfall. He was its architect, and the motive, as always, was layered politics, theology, and something else, something hidden. The Templars had always answered to the Pope alone. That was their shield and their sword, the clause in their founding rule that made them untouchable to secular lords. For nearly 2 centuries they operated across kingdoms, a kind of pan-Christian force whose loyalty transcended borders. But that same independence made them dangerous, and by the early 1300s both Philip IV of France and Clement V found them inconvenient. Philip needed money. Clement needed quiet. And somewhere in the middle, perhaps, lay something else they both desired. Officially, Clement claimed he was coerced. that he issued the order to arrest the Templars under pressure from Philip. That may be true. But papal correspondence tells a more entangled story. Weeks before the October raids, Clement had already begun sending confidential letters to bishops across Europe, preparing the ecclesiastical infrastructure to seize and hold sacred objects. The arrests may have been sudden, but the storage arrangements were not. One letter preserved in the Vatican's codices refers cryptically to objects whose exposure may wound the faithful and recommends their reclassification under apostolic secrecy. The phrasing is unusual. This wasn't standard heresy protocol. This was containment. A separate note to the Bishop of Maguelone mentions a shipment of Templaria Sanctissima arriving under papal seal to be housed in vaults of perpetual silence. And here's the thing, those vaults existed. Beneath Avignon, beneath Lateran structures in Rome under the sprawling shadow of Castel Sant'Angelo, papal strongholds had more than enough room for items that could never be displayed. The betrayal came into full view with the issuance of the bull Pastoralis Praeeminentiae. On the surface, it was a gesture of submission, the Pope instructing all Christian monarchs to arrest the Templars. But buried within its clauses was a strange insertion that any non-financial items taken from the Templars were to be turned over directly to the Church, not to local authorities. Not catalogued, not returned, just handed over like contraband. You can almost see the parchment, the looping Latin script, the vague but authoritative phrasing designed to blur what exactly constituted non-financial. And perhaps the greatest irony, the Church justified this seizure in the name of protecting the faith. That anything deemed heretical had to be hidden, not because it was false, but because it might lead others astray. This is where the story begins to tilt. If these items were mere superstition, false idols, why guard them so closely? Why not burn them publicly, as was done with countless other so-called heresies? Some scholars suggest that Clement, like many in his position, feared what these relics implied. That the Templars had acquired objects or documents that contradicted the Church's version of early Christianity. Not because they were Gnostic or pagan, those would have been easier to dismiss, but because they were too close to something real. One chilling note comes from the inquisitorial records of Jacques de Molay, the Templar Grand Master. Though heavily redacted, a surviving summary from a papal notary states he refused to name the vessels in the inner chamber. When pressed, he wept and said only, "You have them now. Do not show them. Do not let them touch light." That testimony was not entered into the final trial transcripts. It was found scribbled in the margin of a monk's private notebook, forgotten in a monastery archive until the 18th century. The betrayal wasn't just political, it was theological. Clement V handed over brothers who had sworn loyalty to his office, erased their order with a single seal, and then claimed it was all for the greater good. But between his papal bulls and whispered warnings, a different image emerges, that of a man who knew exactly what was being taken and feared the consequences if anyone else did. Philip got the gold, but Clement kept the keys. That strange division of spoils would go on to define the next phase of the mystery, for while France crumbled under the weight of war and famine, the Church quietly grew, its archives expanded its subterranean vaults, and developed a new vocabulary for what must be hidden. It wasn't theft, it was safekeeping. And as you trace this betrayal forward through the corridors of time, a pattern begins to form, one where relics don't disappear. They're just renamed, reframed, and buried under the weight of holiness. The echoes of that first betrayal would follow every relic from that night forward. And among them, perhaps, was an object so feared, so divisive, that both king and pope agreed it could never be seen again. It's always the missing lists that matter most, not the florid accusations, not the burned parchment, not even the final decrees signed with flourishes and blessings. It's the absences, those quiet spaces in the record, where names, dates, and objects should be that scream loudest across the centuries. And in the case of the Templars, one particular absence yawns like a chasm: the inventory of their sacred relics seized in Paris in 1307, supposedly logged for transfer to ecclesiastical custody, yet nowhere to be found. Templar commanderies were meticulously organized. Their Parisian headquarters just off the old Rue du Temple was more fortress than monastery. Beneath its vaulted floors lay treasure vaults, scroll archives, and relic rooms. Royal notaries reported an inner sanctum accessible only to the Grand Master and 2 deputies, and every object from ceremonial chalices to portable altars was catalogued cross-referenced by location, purpose, and spiritual classification. Yet when the French crown and papal agents descended that October, they claimed to find nothing of note. A few coins, some unremarkable manuscripts, one cracked ivory reliquary. That's the official version. Unofficially, the story turns stranger. Royal Treasurer Guillaume de Nogaret, a key figure in orchestrating the arrests, privately complained to the king that the treasure of spirit and blood had been removed prior to our arrival. His phrase, treasure of spirit and blood, would haunt future historians. Some interpret it symbolically referencing Templar spiritual authority. Others believe it was literal objects tied to Christ's passion, or even more ancient rites. A few bolder voices suggest he referred to an actual physical inventory spirited away just days before the raid. There is one tantalizing clue: a letter from a Carthusian monk named Brother Mathieu, dated October 10th, 3 days before the arrests. Preserved in a provincial monastery, the letter warns of a purge from the West and mentions our brethren have moved the sacred vessel, the lamp, and the sealed text to the appointed hands. The phrasing is poetic, almost liturgical, but its timing is undeniable. Was there advance warning, and if so, who gave it? The Vatican's own archives, or rather what they allow scholars to see, are maddeningly silent. For an event of such magnitude involving a major religious order, one might expect comprehensive documentation. But between 1307 and 1312, the catalogue of confiscated Templar goods is curiously thin. The few lists that survive pertain mostly to property, landholdings, livestock, warehouses. One short scroll, stored in Avignon, dated late 1307, contains a note in faded ink, 5 reliquaries unmarked, received from agents of the temple. Contained unknown, sealed under papal seal. That's it. No description, no follow-up. As if knowing the contents was never the point, only ensuring they disappeared. Modern Vatican inventory logs, the ones accessible to outsiders, still show gaps. A 1951 review of Relics without Provenance, conducted by the Pontifical Commission on Sacred Heritage, quietly noted the presence of several 14th-century items with Templar-style craftsmanship, but no acquisition records. Among them, a silver box engraved with an 8-pointed cross and a Latin phrase translating loosely to "in the bloodlight." It is officially labeled Anonymous French Devotional Object, though the wording matches a known Templar rite for Eucharistic ceremony. The true inventory, if it was written at all, may never have been ink on parchment. The Templars were deeply secretive, and as the threat to their order grew, it's plausible they adopted oral transmission. One chronicler notes that the Grand Master's deputy in Paris was seen murmuring prayers in Provençal dialect the night before the arrests, an unusual practice for a Latin-trained cleric. Some interpret this as a last ritual, perhaps even a mnemonic chant, encoding the location or nature of specific relics. A few lines of that chant have survived in folklore among rural brotherhoods in southern France, though heavily corrupted. One version ends with a cryptic phrase, What cannot be weighed must be carried in silence. Not exactly helpful for modern inventory purposes. And yet, despite the lack of official records, the inventory's shadow lingers. Later, Inquisition interrogations mention objects the captors never admitted to finding. One Templar, under torture, insisted that the vessel of light was taken by the man of two robes. Another spoke of a list written in flame burned after the crossing. These might be metaphors. They might be hallucinations. But they might also reflect something real, a hidden list, a secret transfer, a burning of the evidence before it could fall into royal or ecclesiastical hands. The loss of the inventory isn't merely an archival tragedy. It's a deliberate erasure. Because if those objects were truly heretical, then their existence should have been meticulously recorded and condemned. But if they weren't, if they were sacred, strange, or dangerously revelatory, then concealment makes more sense than prosecution. That choice not to display, but to disappear, aligns perfectly with the Vatican's evolving strategy. Not all truths are denied. Some are simply moved out of sight, relabeled, stored in climate-controlled rooms beneath stone cathedrals, where only a select few may tread. You begin to realize the vanished inventory isn't just a physical list. It's a symbol, a map of intentional forgetting, and somewhere perhaps in a drawer within the Archivio Segreto Vaticano, there lies a scrap of parchment worn at the edges, numbered, but unnamed, a trace of the Templar vault, written by a hand that knew no one must ever see it again. You've heard the stories, fragments of the true cross, the Holy Grail, the spear that pierced Christ's side. These are the relics of the Passion, sacred vessels and splinters that stirred centuries of pilgrimage, devotion, and yes, obsession. But what most people don't realize is that by the late 13th century, many of these relics were not in papal vaults or royal chapels. They were in the hands of the Knights Templar. Now that complicates things. The Templars, after all, were not just soldiers. They were collectors, curators, and in some cases competitors in the economy of holiness. Their vast network of commanderies stretched from the vineyards of France to the shores of Acre, giving them unprecedented access to Crusader spoils and Eastern Christian artifacts. And they didn't just collect relics, they guarded them with an intensity that bordered on the esoteric. In some places, they built private chapels with no public access. In others, entire vaults were hidden behind false walls, their interiors described only in oral traditions passed from master to master. One particularly strange account comes from a Genoese merchant named Tommaso de Sant'Angelo, who recorded in 1291 that he had seen a silver-covered vessel red with rubies, carried only by veiled brothers in silence, never during daylight. He assumed it was a chalice. But the ritual, the veils, the silence, the timing, suggests something more than mere reverence. It hints at fear, or perhaps awe. What's less commonly known is that in 1247, Louis IX of France purchased what was believed to be the crown of thorns and brought it to Paris. But before it ever reached Sainte-Chapelle, it spent nearly a year stored in the temple compound, under Templar guard. Officially, this was for protection. Unofficially, there were whispers that during this time copies were made, not for display, for devotion, or perhaps for something more occult. One Venetian letter claims that the thorn was doubled, for no man can tell one from another. That phrase would later be found in a marginal note of a confiscated Templar manuscript, right next to a stylized drawing of a circular reliquary curiously labeled T. Some scholars suggest this stands for Thorn Sanctissima. Others aren't so sure. But perhaps the most enduring rumor is that the Templars possessed a chalice, not the Holy Grail in the romantic sense, but a blood relic said to contain dried crimson residue on its inner rim. A description matching this object appears in the Inquisition records of one Arnaud de Cunières, a Templar arrested in Toulouse. He claimed under questioning that the order fed no man with it, and that only those who had endured the sign could witness it unveiled. When asked what the sign was, he refused to speak even under torture. His inquisitors eventually noted he had perished without revealing the vessel. Now that might be chalked up to myth or delusion, except that years later, a German bishop visiting Rome wrote in a private letter to his nephew that he had glimpsed a blackened cup held behind triple bars, said to be from the Knights of the Temple. He saw it in the Vatican. No further comment. And here we confront the real dilemma: if the Templars possessed relics of the Passion relics that rivaled or perhaps even contradicted official church holdings, then their dissolution wasn't just about heresy or politics. It was about control. Control over narrative. Control over the sacred. The Church maintains strict procedures for verifying relics, most of which were formalized after the Templars were gone. Before that, it was far messier. Blood-stained cloths, shards of wood, unsealed ampullae, these objects passed from crusader to priest to monk without formal authentication. The Templars, with their financial muscle and access to the East, were perfectly positioned to gather, replicate, or even fabricate relics with frightening precision. And that alone would be enough to warrant containment. A few decades after the order's fall, Pope Benedict XIII reportedly commissioned a secret review of Passion relics in church custody. An internal memo from his administration, never meant for public release, lists 2 items as unaccounted for, but suspected to reside within closed holdings, under curia protection, not for display. One was a fragment of a crossbeam, the other simply labeled Vessel of the Sanguis Christi. And here we circle back to the vanished Templar inventory. Because some believe the reason it disappeared isn't to protect financial assets, but because it included items too sacred, too controversial, or too conflicting to be named alongside papal relics. If the Templars held a different version of the Passion story, one embedded in objects rather than scripture, then suppressing those items became essential for preserving theological consistency. After all, it's difficult to run a religion if there's more than one relic of the crucifixion, and yours isn't the one people believe in. So the Vatican took them. Quietly, permanently, and with just enough paperwork to hint they had never existed at all. But sometimes silence leaves fingerprints. There's something unsettling about linen. It's humble, quiet, almost forgettable until it's not. Until it holds a shape, or a stain, or a memory. For centuries, one such cloth has stirred quiet obsession across the Christian world, the Shroud of Turin. A faded, elongated image of a man scorched into fabric, bruised, pierced, lifeless. To some, it's the burial cloth of Christ. To others, an elaborate medieval forgery. But between those extremes lies a murkier possibility that this artifact once belonged to the Knights Templar, and that the Vatican didn't just discover it, it reclaimed it. Let's follow the folds. The shroud's modern provenance begins in the 14th century, when it first appears in the possession of a noble family in Lire, France. But there's no record of how it got there. No shipment logs, no ecclesiastical handoffs, just arrival. A man named Geoffroy de Charny, a knight with vague Templar connections and a suspiciously well-guarded estate, claims it as a relic, one he refuses to explain. When the local bishop questions its authenticity, Geoffroy simply shrugs. No defense, no denial. As if the answer was never meant to be shared. But here's where things grow more curious. Geoffroy's grandfather, also named Geoffroy de Charny, died alongside Jacques de Molay, the last Grand Master of the Templars, burned at the stake in 1314. Both men went to the flames without renouncing their faith, and both had served in positions that would have granted them access to the order's inner sanctum. So when a relic as explosive as the shroud shows up just a few decades later in the hands of a family steeped in Templar legacy, the connection becomes hard to dismiss. Now imagine you're the Vatican watching this unfold. Suddenly, a controversial object reemerges, one that shows the image of a crucified man bearing wounds in all the right places, but created using methods no one can explain. Radiocarbon dating centuries later will confuse the issue, further bouncing between the 13th and 14th centuries, adding more questions than answers. But in the 1350s, the Church had a simpler instinct: suppress first, investigate later. The Bishop of Troyes tried to shut the exhibit down. Papal envoys were dispatched. The cloth was quietly removed, then reappeared elsewhere, now under closer watch. Eventually, it made its way to Turin, where it was tucked under the wings of ecclesiastical authority, sealed with enough ceremony to convince the faithful it had always been there. But many believe the shroud didn't simply appear in the 14th century, it resurfaced. Because long before its public debut, there were hints of a sacred linen circulating among the Templars. In the trial records of Jean de la Foire, a brother interrogated under the Inquisition, he describes a cloth folded many times, bearing the likeness of a man who suffered death. When asked if it was a painting, he shook his head. "It was not made by hand," he said. "It came from the East. It was given to us." That testimony was deemed heretical and omitted from the final transcripts. Another account buried in a minor annal from Cyprus mentions a relic called the Veil of Light, brought west during the fall of Acre. It was reportedly carried by 4 knights who vanished shortly afterward. Some think it was taken to the temple in Paris. Others believe it made its way to Switzerland, where certain monastic orders had ties to Templar refugees. Either way, it vanished from public view until, oddly enough, it returned. And here's where the Vatican's seal comes in. Secrecy, after all, isn't silence. It's protocol. When objects of uncertain origin enter the papal archives, especially those tied to relics, they are catalogued under a system known as custodia aeterna, eternal custody. Items under this classification are not to be displayed, replicated, or described outside approved channels. A handful of such entries exist in papal inventories from the 14th century, one of which describes a linen of unknown image burned at one corner, held within a cedar case bound by iron and lead. The item's identifier, T31A. The description matches early accounts of the Turin shroud, including the detail of one scorched corner. That's not the kind of coincidence that settles well. So was the shroud, a relic, a message, a trap. Some scholars believe the Templars used it in secret rites not as idol worship, but as a meditative artifact, a bridge between mortality and divinity. If true, it would explain the order's apparent reverence and silence, but it would also explain the Vatican's swift intervention. The Church has always been careful with visual theology. A single unauthorized image of Christ, especially one tied to an outlawed brotherhood, could sow the kind of theological panic no papal bull could undo. Which brings us to today. The shroud, now housed in the Cathedral of St. John the Baptist in Turin, is displayed sparingly. Pilgrims flock to see it when permitted, but the Church continues to dance carefully around its authenticity. Officially, it's a devotional image. Unofficially, it's a relic too powerful or too confusing to be named outright. And its journey traced backward leads not to simple forgery or divine miracle, but to the moment the Templars lost everything and someone decided what must be saved, or what must be kept out of sight. So maybe it wasn't the flames of 1314 that changed the world. Maybe it was the folding of a cloth, the snap of a cedar case closing, and the sealing of a Vatican archive door, all so that no one would ask why a relic too sacred to burn had once belonged to the men the Church erased. Picture the roads of southern France in the autumn of 1307. Muddy, winding paths crossing vineyards and stone bridges still echoing with the hoofbeats of knights. But these were not gallant crusaders or papal envoys. These were wagons covered in thick canvas and guarded not by soldiers, but by monks, Dominicans, some said, though none wore the usual habits. They moved quietly, avoiding towns, traveling at odd hours. And according to a handful of local records, they were bound for one destination, Avignon. At the time, Avignon was not yet the seat of the papacy, but it was quickly becoming the Church's new center of gravity. Pope Clement V had relocated there, citing unrest in Rome, though many suspected it was to remain under the watchful eye of King Philip IV. What's less discussed is how this quiet corner of Provence became overnight a storage hub for relics, documents, and objects that no chronicler dared describe in detail. Several town ledgers, the kind used to track livestock and road tariffs, include curious entries between October and December of 1307. Mentions of heavy carts exempt from toll passing under clerical protection. One record from the hamlet of Valreas notes a convoy of 3 wagons escorted by men of the cloth, bound for the papal residence. The tax clerk, bless his detail-oriented soul, added a strange note in the margin, sealed crates, iron-bound. Contents not inspected by request of holy authority. That's not standard protocol for relics. That's not even standard protocol for gold. That's what you write when you're told not to look. The timing aligns perfectly with the Templars' downfall. Mere days after the arrests in Paris, shipments began moving south, not by royal courier, but under church authority. Not to cathedrals, but to an emerging papal stronghold still being retrofitted to house something large, secret, and non-liturgical. You begin to wonder what could have required such coordination. Avignon's architecture holds its own clues. Beneath the Palais des Papes, the massive fortress palace eventually built to host the papal court, there exists a warren of underground chambers. Some were used as cellars, others as scriptoriums. But one wing locked to this day is known simply as the Trésor clos, the closed treasury. It appears in construction records from 1310 as a chamber of stone without windows, sealed on all sides save one archway, whose door shall bear the papal mark and no key shall be copied. The purpose unclear. No inventory, no consecration, just a room made to be shut. The shipments were not lost on contemporary observers. A Franciscan chronicler named Pietro da Monza wrote in his journal of a great movement of cloaked brothers, carrying crates, as if fleeing an invisible fire. He remarked on the anxious looks and the strange incense that clung to the cloths covering the boxes. Another record from a Dominican priory near Orange described brothers from the north, arriving to seek sanctuary, bearing sacred items wrapped in skins, which were to be seen only by eyes of ordination. When pressed, the prior burned the page, but not before a novice copied the lines into his own diary, a footnote that centuries later became one of the few surviving glimpses into the relic transfer. What were they moving? Some suggest gold. Others say documents. But most theories, the ones whispered not printed, center on relics. Templar relics. Objects with no known liturgical use, too sacred to destroy, and too dangerous to explain. A certain reliquary perhaps rumored to hum when unsealed. A box carved with Arabic script and Latin blessings. Or the vessel Arnaud de Cunières refused to describe under torture. The silence is almost worse than speculation. And it wasn't just relics. One document uncovered in the Vatican's restricted archive, a partial list recovered during an early 20th century inventory purge, includes a phrase that jumps off the page: items of the order, delivered under fear of corruption, to be stored as if never received. The handwriting matches a known papal secretary of Clement V, And the location, it simply says AV, nothing more. That little abbreviation has stirred quite the debate. Some say it stands for Archivum Vaticanum, but others, looking at the date and the context, point to something far simpler: Avignon. You see, not everything sacred went to Rome. Some things went into limbo, a place just far enough from power to be safe and just close enough to never be forgotten. In Avignon, the Church could sort, study, decide which objects might be incorporated into official tradition and which must be buried under layers of liturgical silence. The Church never admitted to any of this, of course. Ask today, and Avignon is celebrated for its beauty, not its shadows. The Palais des Papes hosts concerts now. Visitors stroll through its frescoed halls, unaware that beneath their feet may rest relics that once passed through Templar hands, relics deemed too powerful, too strange, or too contradictory to see daylight. And yet the dust remains. The crates remain. The seals unbroken. Not destroyed, just withheld. And in a way, that's worse. In the heart of the Vatican, not far from the gilded chapels and marble saints, exists a category of servant you'll never see during a guided tour. They don't wear the red robes of cardinals or the white of holiness. They don't celebrate Mass or interpret Scripture in public. Their role is quieter and far more dangerous. They are the keepers of what must never be spoken, the curators of the Church's forbidden past. And their roots, strangely enough, can be traced to the year 1312, the year the Templars officially ceased to exist. Their title has shifted over the centuries: archivists, custodians, protectors of relics, non-confirmati. But their purpose has always remained the same: to manage the spiritual debris left behind by power struggles and suppressed doctrines. Their task is not to destroy. That would be far too easy. Their task is to seal, categorize, and forget methodically. And when you look closely at their origins, you find something both revealing and unsettling. The very first mention of such a role appears not in a papal bull, but in a private memorandum from the Council of Vienne, held in the same year the order was dissolved. That council is remembered for rubber-stamping Clement V's decision to dismantle the Templars. But buried beneath its political proclamations was a smaller internal directive marked ad internum. It ordered the creation of a special ecclesiastical chamber to process and safeguard spiritual materials deemed incompatible with doctrinal display. That's a long-winded way of saying, put this where no one will find it. Soon after, a handful of individuals, all monks trained in both theology and archival science, were appointed to carry out this hidden mandate. They reported not to bishops, but directly to the papal office. Their tools weren't censers and crosses, but ink, wax, and lead. Their workroom was windowless, buried beneath Lateran buildings. Their duties were simple sort. The Templar materials that had survived confiscation identify objects and documents that might threaten church unity and ensure those items were never shown sighted or, heaven forbid, venerated. It is said that one of the first items catalogued by these custodians was a reliquary bearing no inscription, but containing a piece of cloth saturated with a dark, rust-colored stain. The Templars had stored it in a sealed chest, marked only with the letter M. The monk assigned to catalogue it wrote in his journal that the object emitted an odor of myrrh and iron, and that he wept without reason while handling it. The journal ends abruptly 3 days later. No record of the object appears again, except in a coded reference to item number 7 in the custodial index of 1314, now locked in the Vatican's non-public archives. Over time, this team of silent guardians developed rituals of their own, not religious in the traditional sense, but procedural, the choreography of erasure. Each item was logged twice, once in a visible registry for official scrutiny, and again in a hidden codex known as the Index Absentium. That second ledger listed not just the item, but its potential to destabilize faith, ranked on a scale of 1 to 5. Items rated 4 or 5 were marked with a small black flame. That symbol reappears centuries later in Vatican correspondences concerning relics believed to be of Templar origin, suggesting the classification system survived through quiet continuity. By the 17th century, the custodians were no longer just monks. Some were Jesuits. Others came from noble families with long ties to the Church's inner circles. They were trained in languages, ancient texts, even rudimentary chemistry to test materials, verify blood traces, detect forgeries. And always their allegiance was not to public truth, but to the preservation of divine authority. If a relic whispered a version of Christ's story that differed from the official Gospels, it was silenced. Not by fire, by filing. One particularly haunting case involves a carved wooden box found during renovations at a Templar commandery in northern Spain. Inside was a manuscript wrapped in faded linen written in Greek and a strange shorthand resembling Coptic. The text described a vision supposedly from a knight during his imprisonment of a man crowned not with thorns, but with stars whose blood fell upward into heaven. The custodians who reviewed the document assigned it a rating of 5 and transferred it to the Archivum Tenebris, the so-called Archive of Shadows. The location of that archive is unknown today. Some believe it was absorbed into the modern Archivio Segreto Vaticano. Others think it no longer exists in this world, just in whispered memory. And so the chain continues. One relic, one document. One forgotten name at a time, quietly sealed, carefully logged, gently exiled from history. Of course, official church doctrine would never acknowledge these people or their work. Ask a modern Vatican librarian about forbidden relics, and you'll get a smile, a soft chuckle, maybe even a Latin pun. But in private, some admit the archives are deeper than they appear. One former staffer once described walking past a door with no keyhole flanked by guards who never rotated. I asked what was inside, he said. They told me faith. Then they told him never to ask again. So when we talk about the relics seized from the Templars, remember not all were hidden in vaults. Some were hidden in rituals and jobs with no public titles in the hands of men trained to carry silence like sacrament. The Church never burned all the relics. It simply gave them new keepers. It is tempting to believe that truth always survives, that beneath pain, beneath fear, beneath the cracking of bones and the hiss of heated iron, some thread of honesty remains. But the Inquisition knew better. They understood that people would say anything under torture. And yet when hundreds of Templars across Europe began repeating the same strange phrases about heads idols, secret kisses, and vessels of light, it became harder to dismiss these testimonies as pure invention. The details were too consistent, too visceral, and far too peculiar to be fabricated wholesale. The Church called these confessions the ravings of broken men, but some of them feel less like hallucination and more like memory. Take Brother Gerard of Béziers, for example. Under the hands of inquisitors, he confessed to seeing a head with glass eyes resting on red velvet, which was brought forth during prayers. When asked what it meant, he stammered, "It watched us." It was brought from the East. We were told it was wisdom itself. His inquisitors tried to force him to denounce it as heresy, but Gerard insisted it was not an idol, it was a relic. Sacred, revered. Then came a detail that has haunted theologians for centuries. He claimed the head spoke, not with words, but with warmth. A sensation, he said, like standing near a brazier even when the room was cold. Another testimony, this time from Jean de Saint-Omer, spoke of a sealed vessel passed hand to hand, in silence never opened, but venerated with a bowed head. He described the ritual as neither mass nor madness, and said the object was older than the Church, but not older than the Lord. When pressed to clarify, he could only weep. Many Templar confessions made mention of a ritual kiss on the spine, the nape, the mouth, each placement carrying symbolic weight. While inquisitors interpreted these acts as perversions, some modern scholars suggest they may have mimicked ancient anointing practices, perhaps linked to relics of apostolic succession or blood rites. It is telling that no two confessions ever described the ritual identically, yet they all shared that same theme: reverence, secrecy, and something that couldn't quite be named. But of all the objects mentioned, it was the head that appeared most frequently. The infamous Baphomet, a name likely twisted through languages, and fear is often treated today as an invention of the Church, a smear tactic born from the fevered imaginations of torturers. And yet the consistency of its description defies easy dismissal. Oval-shaped, human-like, framed in silver or gold. Some said it had 3 faces, others just one. Some called it beautiful, others terrifying. But many agreed on one detail: its eyes were unsettlingly real. Glass, perhaps, or something older. A handful of testimonies described the head being used during admissions into the inner circle of the order. One knight claimed it knew if a brother was lying. Another said its gaze burned with light when truth was spoken. These may be embellishments. Trauma does strange things to memory, but they point to a belief system centered on relics as living intermediaries, not passive objects. That would put the Templars at odds with the Church's doctrine of veneration, which insisted relics were reminders, not conduits. And this is where the narrative sharpens. Because if the Templars believed their relics could speak, or at least resonate with the divine, then those relics weren't just dangerous, they were heretical by papal standards. Not because they were false, but because they bypassed the Church's authority. Curiously, the Vatican's inquisitorial manuals from this period contain marginalia scribbled notes by examiners hinting at confusion. One reads, "The brothers speak not of demons, but of some presence in the object." This is not idolatry as we understand it. That's not condemnation. That's curiosity, the kind a theologian whispers before someone higher up tells him to burn the parchment. What makes this web of confessions so difficult to unravel is that the Church never formally published the full transcripts. Most of what we know comes from fragments, private copies, or rediscovered notes hidden in monastery basements. The Vatican's official position was that the order's rites were impure, their beliefs corrupted. But it's hard to ignore how quickly and thoroughly the evidence was sealed, scattered, or destroyed. If the confessions had truly been nonsense, they could have been dismissed publicly. Instead, they were buried. One Jesuit archivist in the 18th century, Father Ludovico Malvasia, claimed to have found a chest of Templar confession transcripts in a sealed vault beneath Castel Sant'Angelo. He wrote that the testimonies contradict themselves, yet speak to one object, a thing held in awe and in horror. He requested permission to study the chest. A year later, he was reassigned to a remote parish in Sicily. The chest was never seen again, and so we're left with fragments, tortured words, spoken through cracked lips, eyes blurred with tears and blood. And in those fragments, a recurring pattern: relics that burned without fireheads, that watched without blinking, and rituals that spoke of knowledge too old to be written down. Perhaps the confessions under torture weren't meant to reveal heresy. Perhaps they revealed something far more dangerous, an alternate channel of sacred authority carried in silence by men who would rather die than let the relics speak for themselves. And perhaps the Vatican didn't fear what the Templars believed. It feared that they might be right. It sat upon a crimson cloth, always covered when not in use. No one looked directly into its face unless permitted, and even those who had Templar initiates, often blindfolded before entering the chamber, spoke of the moment in hushed tones as though they had seen something more than bone and metal. The object they described was not a skull, not exactly, not a statue either. It was referred to over and over again as the head, and always with the reverence usually reserved for saints. The Church called it Baphomet, a name still tossed around today, warped into a demonic caricature with goat horns and pentagrams. But the term itself, most historians agree, likely emerged from corrupted Arabic Abu Fihamat, father of understanding. If true, the name changes everything. Because what the Templars revered may not have been a pagan idol, but a relic of perception, of insight, a head not of evil, but of wisdom. Testimonies from the Templar trials described it in contradictory ways. Some said it was metal, others wood, others flesh, encased in silver. Some swore it had 3 faces. Others said one with a beard and glassy eyes. Yet despite the variation, a common thread runs through the accounts: the belief that it could offer counsel or judgment, or something close to prophecy. A brother named Etienne de Troyes, questioned under duress, described the head as the remains of a holy man preserved from before the Church's founding. When asked who the man was, he replied, "No one knows his name. He spoke before Peter." The Inquisitors dismissed this as gibberish, but to the Templars it likely meant something profound. A relic from before the formal apostolic era, something that hinted at an earlier wisdom tradition, one which Christianity later absorbed or eclipsed. One of the most striking records comes from a confiscated letter found in a Templar stronghold in Aragon. It's addressed to the Master of Portugal, and reads, "The head has been moved." The chamber is sealed. Its voice is silent, but its eyes remain open. That sentence, poetic or literal, has puzzled historians for centuries. If the head were a relic, say the skull of a prophet martyr or Gnostic teacher, then its possession would have given the order tremendous symbolic authority. Perhaps too much. Enough to unsettle both monarchs and popes. There's another layer to this. In the Byzantine East, early Christians were known to preserve relics of revered teachers, not just apostles, but philosophers who predated formal orthodoxy. The idea of a thinking relic was not entirely foreign. Several monasteries were said to possess the skulls of mystics, believed to still emit divine insight. The West dismissed such practices as superstition, but the Templars, with their deep exposure to Eastern traditions, may have viewed them differently. There's even a precedent in the veneration of John the Baptist's head. Multiple cities in Europe claimed to possess it: Damascus, Amiens, Rome. In some places it was said to weep, in others to glow. Could the Templars have acquired one such object or something even older that bore a similar aura? Could they have believed it was the vessel of some transcendent knowledge? If so, it would explain the obsession and the secrecy. But the Church could not tolerate ambiguity in relics. A head that offered knowledge apart from Scripture. A relic that whispered its own wisdom that was not veneration. That was heresy. Or worse, autonomy. There are hints that after the arrests, the Church made special effort to locate and secure this head. One letter from Pope Clement's private secretary refers to an object of singular veneration among the temple's inner circle and recommends its transfer to the sanctum under Dominican oversight. Another document, unsigned but sealed with a papal insignia, lists one object anthropoid in form containing relic matter to be held until nullification. Held, not destroyed. This matches with reports from later Vatican inventories, where an unnamed relic item number TPHI is stored beneath Castel Gandolfo, the Pope's summer residence. A Jesuit archivist who examined the object briefly in the early 20th century described it as a human-shaped vessel the size of a man's head, fitted with reflective eyes and adorned with faded script in Greek and Latin. He noted its disturbing presence, adding, "It does not belong here, but it cannot be elsewhere." The head may have never spoken, but its symbolism alone would have made it radioactive, an object treated as sentient, as guiding, as holy but outside the Church's doctrinal bounds. That would have made it not just dangerous, but competitive, and that perhaps was the greatest sin of the Templars in the eyes of Rome. Not that they venerated relics, but that they chose to keep the sacred for themselves to seek truth through objects that bypassed authority. The head wasn't heresy, it was independence, and so it was taken, sealed, categorized, perhaps still watched by modern-day custodians who do not speak of it but keep its eyes from ever opening again. Because some wisdom once seen cannot be unlearned. It was small, according to the surviving sketches, barely larger than a child's head, made of rose-gold filigree shaped like a teardrop, with 4 thin legs lifting it above its velvet base. At its center, a glass ampule tinted amber said to hold a few reddish granules suspended in oil. It was known to a few medieval chroniclers as the Vas Sacrum Magdalenae, the sacred vessel of the Magdalene, and though its whereabouts are officially unknown, its trail leads directly through the vaults of the Templars and as quietly as a breath into the hands of the Church. Of all the figures in Christian lore, Mary Magdalene is perhaps the most rewritten: penitent prostitute, apostle to the apostles, witness to the resurrection, Gnostic icon. Her story was a battlefield long before Dan Brown turned her into a bestseller plot point. But beneath the speculation lies a simpler truth. By the 12th century, Magdalene was the object of intense local devotion, particularly in southern France, the very region where the Templars were strongest and where her relics were most closely guarded. One of the oldest accounts of the Vas Sacrum appears in a document from Vézelay Abbey dated 1167. It mentions a reliquary of Eastern origin believed to contain oil from Magdalene's burial rites, or as some whispered, a fragment of her preserved blood. At the time, the relic was kept in a side chapel under the care of a group of warrior monks whose description curiously aligns with the Templars, though they are not named directly. The abbey's own seal appears on the reliquary's inventory, but so does an unusual symbol, a Latin cross, with 8 equal points identical to the one used by the Templar order. Fast forward to 1307. When the arrests began, several southern commanderies reportedly transferred key items to abbeys for safekeeping. A Cistercian chronicle from Toulouse notes that an object of crimson reverence guarded by our Eastern brethren was entrusted to us in haste. The entry was crossed out in the 15th century with red ink and the phrase non confirmatur, not verified, but the damage had already been done. The reliquary had existed, and someone had wanted it forgotten. What made this relic dangerous wasn't its composition. It wasn't gold or jeweled. It didn't glow or bleed. Its danger was theological. If the object did indeed hold blood Magdalene's, or otherwise it disrupted the carefully manicured relic hierarchy of the Church. Women's relics, especially from figures like Magdalene, were venerated cautiously. The idea that a woman might possess her own relic cult independent of male apostolic oversight was unsettling. And if the Templars revered it, not just as a devotional object, but as a symbol of a sacred lineage that would explain the Church's eagerness to bury its existence. There's a curious story from the inquisitorial records of a Templar knight named Hugo de Saint-Remy. During questioning, he was asked about relics held at the Temple Chapel in Marseille. He replied, "We kept the glass tear. It belonged to her who saw him first. We did not pray to it. We remembered through it." The inquisitor, confused, pressed him to name the her. Hugo refused. He was flogged. 3 days later, he hanged himself in his cell. The glass tear reappears in a much later document, this time in the 17th century. An inventory of closed ecclesiastical holdings at the Church of Saint-Martin in Avignon describes a vessel of blood-rose hue contained in a bronze cage with Eastern mounts. It is listed without provenance and marked non-exposé. One scholar who reviewed the document in the 1920s believed it referred to the vas sacrum based on similarities in description and the object's apparent Templar association. However, when he submitted a request to view the item, he was told it had been transferred to Rome, destination unspecified. If the reliquary did make its way to the Vatican, it likely disappeared into one of the classified compartments beneath the Apostolic Palace, or worse, was dismantled and its contents destroyed. Not for theological reasons, the Church was quite fond of relics after all, but because the meaning it carried threatened narrative control. Magdalene, as a bearer of sacred matter, undermined a structure in which only apostolic male successors passed on holiness. A relic of her blood was a statement, a quiet revolution in gold and glass. And then there's the final clue, subtle, nearly invisible, found in a 14th century missive from a Dominican friar stationed in Avignon. In the margins of a prayer book, he scribbled a note. The vessel has no name, but it remembers hers, a cryptic line easily dismissed. But paired with the historical breadcrumb trail, it echoes with meaning. So what became of the vas sacrum Magdalenae? Perhaps it lies in a Vatican drawer, its tag misfiled, its meaning buried beneath centuries of bureaucracy. Perhaps it was melted down, its contents poured into the earth behind a chapel wall. Or perhaps, just perhaps, it remains intact, sealed behind 3 locks, viewed once a decade, by a handful of clerics who don't even know what they're holding. And in that vessel, suspended in ancient oil, a few fading granules continue to drift, unproven, unspoken, unforgotten. The fire did not consume them. It was meant to, of course, the inquisitors made sure of that. Dozens of scrolls, vellum-bound tomes, and loose-leaf folios, all inscribed with curious diagrams and texts written in Latin, Greek, Arabic, and an indecipherable script that looked like musical notation twisted into geometric forms. They were declared heretical without trial, stacked high in the courtyard of a confiscated Templar preceptory near Poitiers, and set alight in the presence of church witnesses. But according to a single, almost apologetic line in the margin of a Dominican observer's journal, the strange ones were taken aside first. Strange ones. That phrase has clung to the shadows of church history, like smoke. The Templars, for all their reputation as warriors and financiers, were also collectors of knowledge. Not just theology, but something far older, practical, mystical, and deeply forbidden. Alchemy, astrology, numerology, sacred geometry. They didn't merely preserve manuscripts. They translated them, restructured them, annotated them. Many had arrived through Eastern trade routes acquired from Syriac monks, Persian mystics, or the libraries of fallen cities like Antioch. By the 13th century, some Templar libraries contained texts unknown to the broader Latin West, and in the margins of these codices, often in coded shorthand, were their own experiments. What they were experimenting with? Well, that's still a matter of debate. The few surviving fragments, those not burned, lost, or locked away, reveal a startling focus. Not gold transmutation, as was common in later alchemical circles, but something far more esoteric, the manipulation of divine matter. One leaf stored anonymously in the Biblioteca Nazionale in Florence. and attributed to a master of the Red Chapel, describes a ritual using consecrated oil-powdered bone and sunrise light to activate a resonance in the vessel. Another kept quietly in private collection until it resurfaced in a 19th century auction catalogue mentions a sacred lattice of salt and fire through which blood sings. These phrases are poetic, yes, but also unsettlingly specific. And then there's the codex recovered by the Vatican in 1311, now known only by its catalogue name Codex T21. Its contents have never been publicly revealed. But one 18th century Jesuit scholar who claimed to have briefly handled it described it as a treatise of metaphysical conjunctions between relics and divine proximity, structured in stages akin to alchemical operations. He added in a footnote that the diagrams bore Templar insignia and a stylized chalice at the center of each page. Why would the Church preserve such texts? Because to destroy them would be to erase knowledge and to confess fear. The Vatican has long maintained two kinds of archives, those it promotes and those it contains. While the latter are off-limits to almost everyone, their presence is unmistakable. In several papal inventories from the 14th and 15th centuries under restricted categories appear entries labeled MSS Ordo Templi, restricted for review, not for consultation. These were not thrown into furnaces. They were shelved, quietly. The presence of alchemical texts among Templar relics hints at a dimension of the order rarely acknowledged. They were not simply hoarding ancient knowledge, they were using it, integrating it, perhaps even building rituals around it. In a confiscated chapel in Provence, investigators found a chamber painted with concentric circles, planetary symbols, and a star map aligned with Jerusalem at equinox. At its center was an altar made not of stone, but of iron and polished brass with grooves etched into its surface. Nearby, a text was found, mostly illegible from smoke damage, but with a single surviving phrase. The light comes not from flame, but from the vessel within. The phrase echoes other scattered lines across Templar documents, recurring references to vessels, to resonance, to blood and light. While some church authorities dismissed these as metaphors, the frequency of the terms suggests they were part of a working vocabulary, a spiritual scientific language shared among inner circles. And here's where things tighten. One of the most detailed interrogations in the Templar trials, that of Brother Raymond of Arles, includes a description of a book of light without letters. He said it was shown only to senior members, kept in a triple-locked chest, and that when opened in darkness, it glowed faintly, as if the stars had entered the page. His words were struck from the final trial record, but the notary kept his original notes rediscovered centuries later in a monastery attic bound in plain leather and hidden behind false prayer books. Even if half these accounts are exaggerations, their consistency speaks volumes. The Templars were not just caretakers of relics. They were in their own way conducting a form of sacred science, a theurgy that blurred the line between faith and physical transformation. And what did the Vatican do with these materials? They sealed them, wrapped them in fresh parchment, recatalogued them under neutral titles, Speculum Ecclesiae, Scriptum de Lumine, and filed them where only a few archivists could ever see. One of those archivists, writing under a pseudonym in 1936, claimed that deep in the stacks of the Archivio Segreto Vaticano, there exists a locked cabinet known only as Capella Manuscripta, containing scrolls whose understanding is not forbidden, only forgotten. Whether the Church believes in the alchemical power of these codices or not may be beside the point. Their continued preservation and concealment suggests a quiet respect, or at least a worry, that in the wrong hands formulas written by Templar monks and forgotten mystics could crack open doctrines that took centuries to solidify. And so they remain not burned, not displayed, but buried in pages that whisper of blood, that sings vessels that glow, and a world where relics are not reminders, but instruments. By the time the last Crusader stronghold fell in 1291, most believed the greatest relic of all, the Ark of the Covenant, had long vanished into legend. Destroyed, hidden, or spirited away by Babylonian fire or divine hands. Even the most devoted scholars admitted its trail went cold after the Book of Kings. But the Templars didn't see things that way. To them, the Ark was not only real, it was reachable. And according to several obscure accounts, they may have come far closer to it than anyone ever realized. The story begins in Acre, the crumbling final stronghold of the Crusader states. As Mamluk forces tightened their siege, Templar ships were loaded not just with weapons and coin, but with crates heavy quiet, unmarked. One account written by a Venetian dockworker speaks of an iron-bound chest guarded by 12 knights, none of whom spoke or ate during embarkation. The ship vanished from official logs, but was later rumored to have landed at Sidon. From there, it was never seen again. But years later, in a small chapel outside Arles, a traveling friar named Laurent de Sceaux wrote in his diary of seeing a stone container with rings of gold carried by 2 men, though it weighed as 10. He described the object as exuding a hum, not audible but felt in the ribs. The friar was dismissed as delusional, his writings locked away. But when his notebook was rediscovered in the 19th century, several lines had been underlined in red ink centuries after his death by someone who had clearly read it with interest. The connection between the Templars and the Ark may sound like a fantasy, but it rests on more than just whispers. The order maintained several commanderies across the Holy Land on ancient temple sites. One near Al-Aqsa Mosque in Jerusalem was built directly above what had once been the Second Temple, the very location most Jewish traditions associate with the Ark's last known presence. Early Templar maps mark subterranean tunnels beneath the complex. Whether they found anything in those vaults remains unknown. But when Saladin recaptured Jerusalem, the Templars seemed unusually desperate to reclaim this particular site, not for strategic value, but for what lay below. And then there's the curious case of the Cartulaire de Troyes, a 14th century manuscript, rediscovered in a private French collection. Among its entries is a list of objects not to be weighed transferred under cover of darkness to papal custody. One item is labeled Arca Ligni Aureati cum Tabulis. That translates roughly to golden wood ark with tablets. The wording echoes the biblical description of the ark, an acacia chest, covered in gold, containing stone tablets. The manuscript is unsigned, but tucked into the binding is a wax seal, the 8-pointed cross of the Knights Templar. Skeptics point to the absence of follow-up records. Surely if the Church had received such an object, it would have documented it, displayed it, made it a centerpiece of divine proof. But that assumes the Church wanted it seen. More likely, the Ark, or whatever resembled it, posed a problem. If it contradicted biblical chronology, or bore inscriptions that conflicted with doctrine, or hinted at a divine order separate from Rome, its mere existence would unravel centuries of narrative. Better to bury it in stone than to risk revelation. Some believe the object was housed briefly in Avignon during Clement V's reign. A coded entry in the 1311 Inventarium Occultum lists one container of mosaic design sealed under triple cord, not for veneration. Triple cord was a designation typically used for items judged unstable either spiritually, theologically, or physically. The item was later moved. The record ends there, but the rumors continued. In 1804, during Napoleon's invasion of Rome, French officers recorded entering a vaulted archive chamber beneath the Lateran, where a box of Middle Eastern construction was stored on an isolated dais. The officer who penned this, Lieutenant Cazeneuve, sketched the box in his field journal. It bears a striking resemblance to the Ark, as described in Exodus 2, rings on each side, decorative carvings, winged shapes on the lid. No follow-up was ever filed. Cazeneuve died of illness weeks later. His journal passed through private hands and disappeared. One grainy photo survives. Even today, inside the Vatican's deepest archives, there are whispers of a chamber known only as Cubo Eternum, the Eternal Cube. Said to contain no books, no scrolls, only objects, physical relics too volatile to display. One retired Swiss guard once referred to it cryptically as the room where the old god sleeps. When asked what he meant, he only said, "Not everything wooden is of this earth." It's possible the Ark never made it west. Perhaps the Templars believed they had found it only to discover a symbolic replica. Perhaps the entire story is a layer of legend, a top layer shaped by hope and grief. But if the Church did take possession of something even remotely resembling the Ark, an ancient chest, a sacred container, a relic of divine law, their silence speaks volumes. Because possession is power. And the greatest power of all is knowing what others are never allowed to see. If you follow the service corridors beneath the Apostolic Palace in Rome, past the storerooms and forgotten archives, you'll eventually reach a place few have ever seen and fewer have spoken about. No sign marks the entrance. No tour guides ever mention it. But every now and then, a reference slips through. A line in a renovation contract, a whisper in a memoir, a footnote in a Vatican ledger, Depositorium Sancta Access Restricted, perpetual custody. That name, Sancta Depositorium, is the closest thing we have to a real designation for what insiders call the Chamber of Relics, a room or perhaps a complex, rumored to house the most sensitive items the Church has ever secured, and according to persistent accounts across centuries, it may have been built specifically to accommodate relics seized from the Templars. The earliest suggestion of its existence appears not in papal correspondence, but in architectural blueprints dated 1323, a decade after the Templars' dissolution, commissioned by Pope John XXIII. The plans outline a subterranean vault beneath the inner sanctum reinforced for containment of divine matter. The language is unusual. The term divine matter is not found in any other ecclesiastical building instructions of the period. But the dimensions are precise: a chamber 30 cubits wide, with no windows, one entrance, and walls layered with lead and stone, a technique typically used to block interference, whether spiritual, energetic, or simply prying eyes. Lead, after all, muffles more than just sound. Later records refer obliquely to this vault during inventories of sacred holdings. In one 1356 account by a Benedictine archivist, a marginal note reads, "Items transferred to the lower vault for indefinite containment, origin OT." The initials OT likely refer to the Ordo Templi, the Latin designation for the Templar order. That simple detail has drawn obsessive attention. Why would items from a defunct military order be stored permanently in the papal heart, beyond the reach of scholars, bishops, even many cardinals? Then, in 1489, we find something extraordinary. A papal bull, unpublished, never publicly acknowledged, surfaced in a private family archive in Venice. It contains a directive signed by Pope Innocent VIII authorizing the physical examination of all contained relics of disputed origin in the lower reliquary. The reason for the review is unclear, but the list of items partially smudged includes one entry that stands out: chalice, provenance unknown, sealed under command of Clement. That likely refers to Clement V, the same pope who ordered the Templars dismantled. The seal, therefore, wasn't a mere legal mark. It was a spiritual boundary, a warning that certain items carried the weight not of sainthood, but of schism. Descriptions of the chamber itself are rare, but some survive. A letter written in 1694 by a visiting Polish bishop recounts being escorted to a lower room, the air chill, and still where cases wrapped in red silk were arranged on altars of stone. He was not allowed to open them. He was only shown a single item, a chain of gold links twisted with thorns. No explanation was given. Other visitors described the smell myrrh and something else, something metallic. One French cleric who was granted access in 1816 wrote in his private journal that the silence inside the chamber was unholy, as if the walls had forgotten how to echo. He mentioned seeing a box marked MT 1312 stored in a recess in the far wall. What those initials stood for, he never learned. But some believe Magdalene Templum is a possibility. Others suggest Materia Templaria. Either way, the date seals the implication it was stored the same year the order was dissolved. By the 20th century, most mentions of the chamber vanish. The Vatican, more adept than ever at managing its internal narratives, simply stopped acknowledging any relics that didn't fit the official hagiographic mold. Pilgrims were shown bones of saints, but they were never told of blood-stained cloths, whose DNA bore no match, or chalices with no Christian origin, or relics inscribed with stars instead of crosses. There's a theory whispered among a handful of archivists and rogue scholars that the Chamber of Relics doesn't just contain forbidden Templar items, it defines them. That some of the objects within were never clearly labeled, never identified, because they didn't match any known tradition. That even today, Vatican custodians periodically re-examine them, hoping for clarity, fearing what they might find. And the fear is real. One Jesuit who worked briefly in archival rotation during the 1970s told a colleague that he had been instructed to avoid cabinet theft entirely. When asked why, he reportedly replied, "Because no one has dared open it since Napoleon." His assignment was changed. The colleague was later transferred to Argentina. What makes all this so compelling and so infuriating is the absolute lack of open documentation. The Chamber of Relics may be Vatican myth, Vatican metaphor, or Vatican reality. But what we know for certain is this: after the Templars fell and their possessions were seized, the Church created new spaces physically and bureaucratically to hold items that did not belong in public theology. And they're still there, locked, guarded, unspoken, not because they are false, but because they remain unexplained. And the Church, above all else, prefers answers it can control. On March 22, 1312, in the cathedral city of Vienne, Pope Clement V raised his hand and signed a single sheet of parchment. The document bore the usual formalities: titles, flourishes, blessings. Its name, Vox in Excelso, sounded divine, almost poetic. But what it actually did was neither poetic nor divine. It obliterated the Knights Templar from the annals of official church recognition. With one seal of wax and ink, nearly 2 centuries of powerland and memory were expunged. To the average observer, the bull was the end of the Templars. But to those watching closely, to those within the Church's inner chambers, Vox in Excelso did more than dissolve an order. It redirected everything they owned, everything they knew, and everything they protected into the hands of a silence more enduring than fire. The official narrative claimed that Templar assets were to be transferred to the Knights Hospitaller, a kind of spiritual inheritance keeping sacred holdings within the care of fellow warrior monks. And on paper, that's exactly what happened. Deeds were amended, lands were redistributed, commanderies were renamed. But a troubling inconsistency soon emerged. The Hospitallers themselves reported that a substantial number of expected items, particularly non-monetary ones, were never delivered. In a letter from Grandmaster Fulques de Villeray to Pope John XXIII just a few years later, he expresses confusion over the absence of relics vessels and sacred books formerly under Templar control. He politely suggests they must have been retained for special custody, but no records ever confirm such custody. They simply vanished. And therein lies the genius of Vox in Excelso. It didn't list what was to be handed over, it just named the new recipient. That omission, subtle and deliberate, allowed for an enormous sleight of hand. Anything deemed unsuitable for transmission, an ambiguous phrase found in a side letter attributed to Cardinal Berenger Fredol, could be quietly diverted. No declaration, no accusation, just quiet redirection. A shuffle into papal storage. This isn't conjecture. The minutes from a secret consistory meeting, held weeks after the bull's release, uncovered in the mid-1800s by a German ecclesiastical scholar, mention items of Eastern origin and mystical association deemed inappropriate for hospitaller governance. Among them were at least 2 vessels with unverified sacral linkage, likely referring to the kinds of relics discussed in earlier Templar testimonies. Their fate held under apostolic discretion. But Vox in Excelso didn't just move objects, it moved perception. The very language of the bull was carefully constructed to portray the suppression of the Templars as a mercy. It claimed no final judgment was passed, only that the scandal surrounding the order made its continuation untenable. It's a curious legal trick. The Templars were dissolved, not condemned. Their guilt was implied, but never ruled. And that ambiguity served a purpose. Because it allowed the Church to claim what it needed, the relics, the writings, the symbols, without endorsing the ideology they may have represented. That ideological murkiness may explain why so many Templar items that did survive were rebranded. Chalices lost their inscriptions. Manuscripts were stripped of their prologues and rebound under new titles. In at least one case, a reliquary box once traced to a Templar chapel in Languedoc now sits in a Vatican collection under the title Artisan Piece Unknown Origin. It contains 3 vials, one of which is sealed with wax bearing the faded imprint of a cross pate, the Templar emblem. Perhaps most telling is the total lack of Templar relics on display in any modern Vatican collection. For an order that once stretched from Scotland to Syria, the Church has remarkably little to show for them. No garments, no chalices, no bones of fallen knights turned into relics of martyrdom. All have either been lost unverified or more likely absorbed under different names. A papal archivist writing in the early 20th century under the pseudonym P.V. left behind a series of internal memos suggesting that a reclassification effort had taken place between 1901 and 1912. In those notes, he refers to 23 Templar items relabeled under neutral ecclesiastical designation, stored without public index. One of those items he claimed bore a crystalline seal with a lettered star, though the object itself was never photographed or described further. The papal bull then was not a burial. It was a laundering. It allowed the Vatican to erase the public identity of the Templars, while preserving the value of their private holdings. It's not difficult to imagine why. Relics rumored to carry apostolic bloodlines, codices written in languages lost to Latin ears, sacred geometry scrawled in the margins of liturgical texts. These were not the kinds of things the Church wanted falling into secular hands, nor inspiring independent cults of devotion. So it did what it does best: it kept them, sealed them, rewrote them. And in doing so, it ensured that the legacy of the Templars would not die, but sleep. Somewhere beneath Rome, behind a locked door inscribed with a star. No one's allowed to speak of the treasures live on, not as relics of heresy nor objects of wonder, but as pieces of a truth too complicated to let into the light. Vox in excelso was the end of the order, but it was the beginning of a vault. They did not wear armor, they did not brandish swords. But they were hunters, nonetheless, scholars in cassocks, Jesuits with diplomatic immunity, archivists with unusually well-funded travel budgets. In the centuries following the fall of the Templars, a quiet campaign unfolded within the highest ranks of the Vatican. Its goal, to locate and retrieve the sacred objects that had escaped the Church's grasp during the chaos of suppression. They weren't seeking treasure. They were recovering control. The first clues come from a series of letters preserved in the Vatican's diplomatic correspondence vaults. Dated between 1624 and 1653, these documents are written in tightly spaced Latin script and bear the insignia of the Congregation of the Index, the office normally charged with censoring books. But these particular letters deal not with heretical texts, but with objects. One letter addressed to a papal envoy in Naples instructs the recipient to inquire discreetly regarding the vessel of the temple lineage said to have passed into the house of Orsini. Another refers to an image of the head carved in Eastern fashion, located somewhere in the Pyrenees. The use of diplomatic couriers for such tasks was no accident. During the 17th century, the Vatican had global reach, and its agents operated under the radar of both secular authorities and inquisitorial tribunals. Disguised as scholars, confessors, or inspectors of liturgical compliance, these men, often Jesuits, moved through courts and monasteries with quiet precision. And wherever Templar descendants, sympathizers, or relic hoarders lingered, they followed. One of the most active agents was a figure named Father Matteo del Conte. A Jesuit priest with a reputation for linguistic brilliance and unusual interests, Del Conte traveled extensively through France, Spain, and the Italian states. His private diary, discovered only recently, in a forgotten box within the Vatican secret archives, details his efforts to reclaim that which was unjustly dispersed. Among the entries is an account of a reliquary found in a defunct Cistercian abbey inscribed with a Templar cross and the word ex sanguis. The relic, according to Del Conte, emitted a faint fragrance of ash and rosewater. He had it boxed and sent to Rome under escort marked for silence. This wasn't just historical curiosity. These men were operating under a theology of correction, the belief that sacred objects, even those associated with disgraced orders, must be protected, studied, and if necessary, contained. Some items were deemed suitable for reintegration into church liturgy. Others were locked away. A few were destroyed, but most curiously were neither condemned nor venerated. They were simply withheld. The effort extended beyond Europe. In the Jesuit missions of the New World, a 1671 report from Peru mentions a golden dish bearing Hebrew letters and a pattern of 4 circles given by a French brother in exile. The brother's name, Etienne de Montfort, believed to be a descendant of Templars who had fled to the colonies under false monastic identities. The dish was shipped to Rome, accompanied by a letter from the Jesuit superior. Its markings are of a style I have seen before but dare not name. Closer to home, papal emissaries tracked down manuscripts thought lost after the Templar purges. A cache of writings turned up in Provence in 1723, stored in the cellar of a noble estate. The texts were theological but encoded and made frequent mention of the vessel of light and the daughter of the Eastern Gate. These were Templar code phrases, the same ones found in earlier interrogation records. The estate was raided. The documents disappeared. There is even evidence of Vatican-sponsored purchases of relics through intermediaries. In the ledgers of the Apostolic Chamber from 1762, a curious line item appears: for the acquisition of the unnamed reliquary from House d'Arques, Città, Florence. No object description, no follow-up notation. But the House d'Arques had long been rumored to possess a collection of Templar fragments, objects passed down through generations and kept behind secret altars. Whatever was bought that year now lies within Vatican walls, unlisted and unshown. Not all hunts ended in success. A letter from 1805 laments the loss of a crimson-stained scroll said to be in the possession of a breakaway sect near Geneva. The scroll was reportedly written in a mix of Greek and Aramaic and described a feast of stars held by men without swords. The agent sent to retrieve it vanished en route. By the late 19th century, the relic hunting mission was less active but no less secretive. The Vatican had become more adept at integrating questionable items under broader relic categories. A reliquary from the Rhone region bearing a Templar insignia might quietly be relabeled as French devotional 14th century. A bloodstone ring once linked to a Templar chaplain could be tucked into a saint's collection without documentation. With time, the cover-up became curation, and yet within the closed circles of ecclesiastical scholarship, the knowledge remains. Senior archivists, the ones with the right keys, the right oaths, still refer to the Collectio Dispersa, a shadow catalogue of relics recovered from post-Templar sources. It is not printed, it is not cited, but it guides decisions behind closed doors. The relic hunters of the Curia were not thieves. They were editors of sacred history. They didn't destroy what they found. They edited it out of public view, wrapped it in linen, sealed it with wax, and placed it behind doors that only open when no one is looking. Because sometimes the greatest danger to faith isn't heresy, it's memory. The story was supposed to end with fire. On a cold March morning in 1314, Jacques de Molay, the last Grand Master of the Knights Templar, was led to a scaffold in the shadow of Notre Dame. Flames licked the edges of the pyre. Witnesses reported that he stood tall, unmoved, and shouted a curse against the king and pope as the fire consumed him. That final act, noble and tragic, has become a symbol of the order's demise. But here's the thing, the fire did not take them all. While the leaders perished, many Templars simply disappeared. Not into the grave, but into the world, absorbed into other orders, other lives, other legends. Some went east, others north. A few likely fled to Portugal or Scotland, where the grip of Rome and Philip IV could not easily reach. But wherever they went, some carried more than memories. They carried relics and the mission to recover what had been taken. What follows is the story of those who didn't give up. The first clues come from an obscure parchment discovered in 1786 in the archives of Montserrat Abbey, Spain. It records the arrival in 1315 of 3 brothers of the Red Temple seeking sanctuary and carrying 2 sealed items of sacred import not to be opened. The monks offered shelter. 1 year later, a fire destroyed part of the abbey, and the brothers vanished. The items were never found. The official explanation, lightning, but a 19th century renovation uncovered a sealed niche behind the altar containing empty reliquary cases and faint traces of wax with markings consistent with Templar seals. More tantalizing are the letters exchanged between Hospitaller commanders in Rhodes during the 1330s. One describes persistent visitors from the West Templar holdouts, disguised as pilgrims who inquired about items once housed in Jerusalem and later transferred to the Southern Gate. That phrase, Southern Gate, appears repeatedly in cryptic correspondence, likely referring to a Templar commandery in southern France, a last waypoint before the Vatican's agents intercepted much of their cargo. But perhaps the most dramatic evidence of these surviving knights comes from the Vatican itself. An internal report labeled De Requisitis Templariorum and dated 1471 reviews, sightings, and activities of persons under assumed priestly orders suspected to operate outside ecclesiastical obedience, seeking lost property of the former temple. The document details several cases across Central Europe, especially in the Alps, where monks were caught attempting to break into sealed reliquary vaults or bribe archivists for access to restricted ledgers. The Vatican referred to them euphemistically as restitutionists. Their goal: to identify, reclaim, and perhaps even return Templar relics to what they believed was the true lineage of guardianship, a lineage that continued quietly beneath the surface of church and state. Some of these recovery efforts were shockingly bold. In 1512, a cardinal in Avignon recorded a break-in at a private chapel where a bloodstone chalice had been kept for generations. The thieves took only the chalice. Nothing else was disturbed. No gold, no books. Just that one item which had been gifted to the church by a noble family tracing its roots to a former Templar knight. A similar pattern emerged in 1627 when a reliquary bearing the Latin inscription Sanguis Redemptoris was stolen from a Franciscan monastery in Piedmont. The reliquary, believed to contain a drop of Christ's blood, had long been rumored to originate from a Templar sanctuary. Two men in clerical robes were seen leaving the site at dawn. Neither was ever identified. And then there are the legends passed down through rural families in Portugal and southern France of hooded riders who appear once a generation asking strange questions about old churches and forgotten tombs. Of men who seem to know ancient rituals, who speak Latin like a mother tongue, and who leave behind nothing but silence and candle wax. These aren't just ghost stories. A few are backed by records. Parish ledgers that mark visitations by brothers unrecorded in our diocese, often followed by missing relics or altered inventories. Even today, Vatican authorities occasionally audit remote sites for irregularities in relic registries, though the reasons are rarely disclosed. Some believe these modern visits are part of an ongoing retrieval mission, that the Church itself, having inherited the secrets once protected by the Templars, now faces a kind of shadow resistance, not militant, not violent, but patient and purposeful. One retired Swiss guard speaking anonymously in the 1990s recalled an incident during his early training. A man in plain clergy garb had presented credentials at a Vatican entrance, asking to access the subterranean vaults. His papers were old, too old, but bore legitimate seals. When questioned, he simply said, "I am here to see what was ours." He was turned away. 2 days later, the door he had requested to enter was found ajar. Nothing was missing, but the guards on duty were replaced. No explanation was ever given. The Church denies the existence of any organized Templar successors, and perhaps that's true. Perhaps the men who survived simply passed down their mission like an ember in ash, a flame too small to see, but never fully extinguished. But relics whisper. And sometimes the hands that reach to touch them are not new. They are old, weathered, disciplined by centuries of silence. So perhaps the Templars did die in 1314, but some of their relics are still being hunted. By knights no longer called knights who no longer wear swords, but still remember the weight of what was lost. By the early 19th century, Europe was shaking off its medieval skin. Monarchs had fallen. Empires were shifting. And at the center of it all, a short Corsican general with imperial ambitions had turned his gaze toward the Eternal City. When Napoleon Bonaparte marched into Rome in 1808, it wasn't merely a conquest of territory. It was a symbolic conquest, a modern man seizing the old world's holiest ground. And in the process, he stumbled upon something the Church had not meant to reveal, a vault beneath the Vatican filled with relics no one was meant to remember. But to understand what was found, We need to start 4 years earlier in 1804 when the French government, in anticipation of Napoleon's coronation and rising tensions with the Papal States, sent a quiet delegation of catalogers and cultural officers to document ecclesiastical holdings of historical significance. Officially, it was about assessing artworks, manuscripts, and sacred relics that might be requisitioned for safekeeping or display in the newly built Musée Napoléon, a vast repository meant to rival the Vatican's grandeur. Unofficially, the team was looking for objects of legendary significance, especially those linked to the temple. Among the delegation was a man named Louis-Alphonse de Villeneuve, a bureaucrat with an eye for relics and a private obsession with the Templars. His journals, recovered decades later from his family estate in Bordeaux, contain meticulous notes on his time inside the Vatican. And one entry dated November 7, 1804, is particularly chilling. He writes, "We were shown a chamber beneath the Lateran. The air was damp, unnaturally still. The cardinal who guided us offered little explanation, merely calling it the old reliquary. The walls were lined with cabinets, each marked only with a letter and a number. In one marked TVI, we found a box of blackened cedar. It bore the symbol of the 8-pointed cross. No tag, no date. Inside, a cloth deep red wrapped around a sealed vial. The seal was unreadable but bore Eastern design. We were told not to touch it. We touched it." Villeneuve does not say what happened next. But his writing becomes erratic, the handwriting sharper, more pressured. Several pages later, he notes only the items marked T remain unlisted. They have been since before the Revolution. There are at least 9. Another officer, Étienne Duclerc, reported in a private letter to his brother that the Holy Father's keepers grow nervous when we ask about the temple relics. He claims to have seen a head-shaped reliquary with gemstone eyes placed hurriedly back into a stone cavity by Vatican staff who pretended it had not been there seconds before. The item, he wrote, was too lifelike to be decorative. Napoleon, for his part, was more concerned with political advantage than relic mysteries. But even he knew how to weaponize symbolism. He instructed his men to take detailed inventories of everything held within the Vatican, especially unlisted objects. While much of this work was later destroyed or hidden following the restoration of papal power, fragments of the 1804 inventory survive. A partial transcription surfaced in 1928 in a rare book dealer's catalog in Florence. Among the listed items, one vessel of gold and bone sealed with wax unmarked, stored under cabinet Thathrine. A box of ironwood inlaid with Arabic lettering and Latin numerals. No key. 2 folded cloths, one scorched, bearing faint image of human form. Label Mandatum Silenti. 3 small reliquaries containing ash fragment of parchment and a tooth. Unregistered cross-shaped seal. Reverse side bears Templar sigil. The last line is crossed out, but the ink bleeds through the page, as if someone changed their mind halfway through erasing. What's most fascinating is that these items were not catalogued using the standard system. They had their own designations, many beginning with the letter T, suggesting they were stored and perhaps classified separately from the Church's official relic archives. This system matches other known Vatican anomalies, such as Codex T21, the alchemical manuscript, believed to originate from Templar holdings. But perhaps the most tantalizing and most disturbing part of the 1804 inventories is what's missing. After Napoleon's fall, when the Church regained control of its territories, there was a mass reorganization of the Vatican's holdings. Many artifacts were quietly destroyed, mislabeled, or transferred to special custody. The inventories from that period make frequent references to unverified items of anomalous origin, not suitable for public veneration. When compared side by side with the 1804 documents, entire object categories disappear. One Vatican archivist writing anonymously in the 1870s referred to these removals as sanatio per oblitum, healing by forgetting. That phrase would appear again in a 20th century report on suppressed Templar objects stored in a vault beneath the Apostolic Palace. The Church has never commented on the 1804 inventories. The Vatican Museum, when asked, claims no knowledge of any relics bearing Templar markings. But some items described in the inventory appear faintly altered in modern holdings, listed as anonymous French devotional objects or Eastern Christian artifacts of uncertain age. The relics remain. Only their names have changed. So what did Napoleon's men really find a momentary glimpse? A door opened just wide enough to see the shadows inside, and though that door was quickly closed again, the rumors spread among scholars, collectors, and those few who still believed the Templars had secrets buried beneath the dome of St. Peter's. Secrets that the Church, even under the threat of revolution, still refused to release. Because some vaults are too sacred to open, and some inventories are written only to be burned. There are symbols that demand attention: crosses, keys, halos, thrones. They speak in the grand visual language of the Church, loud and unmistakable. But then there are quieter marks, the ones that live in wax and ink pressed discreetly onto parchment, never meant for public liturgy. The papal seal is one of these, and yet within its carefully guarded variations lies a riddle that has haunted historians for centuries. Because somewhere along the line, perhaps after the Templars were dissolved and their relics absorbed, a change occurred. Subtle, almost imperceptible, but they're all the same. And it points to something the Vatican has never fully explained. The traditional seal of the papacy Bulla Papalis features the heads of St. Peter and St. Paul on one side, with the reigning pope's name on the reverse. That design has remained consistent since at least the 11th century. But sometime in the early 14th century, a curious anomaly appears: several sealed bulls bearing not the twin apostles, but a cross pate, the very symbol used by the Knights Templar. Most were quietly destroyed, but a handful survived in private collections and remote archives. One sits unsigned and unpublicized in the Biblioteca Apostolica Vaticana, marked non traditur, do not release. The appearance of the Templar cross on papal correspondence would be alarming enough. But what makes these seals truly strange is not just the symbol, it's the layered design. In ultraviolet scans performed by a private researcher in 1983 who was later denied further access, faint lines beneath the cross reveal an older mark, a starburst surrounding a Hebrew character, Aleph, the first letter of the Hebrew alphabet. A symbol associated with beginnings, unity, and occasionally with the Ark. That combination, Templar iconography, Hebrew mysticism papal endorsement, is unheard of in sanctioned church symbolism. Which raises a difficult question. Why would any pope allow his communications to bear such marks unless the content inside those sealed letters dealt with matters the Church didn't want linked to the ordinary line of succession? Matters inherited from the temple. It is important to understand how symbols work inside the Vatican. They are not mere decoration. Every curve, every inscription, every flourish serves a theological or institutional function. To alter the seal is to alter authority, and for a few brief decades after the Templar suppression, that alteration seems to have been intentional. A record in the Liber Secretorum, a rarely accessed register kept by the Papal Secretariat, notes that during the pontificate of Benedict XIV, several private seals of transitional form were approved for use in matters of non-ecclesial sanctity. That phrase is unique. It appears nowhere else in Vatican documentation. Some believe it refers to the categorization of Templar relics, sacred, yes, but outside the framework of canon law. Objects not blessed through traditional rites, yet still imbued with spiritual gravitas. Further complicating things is a peculiar finding from a 17th-century Jesuit historian, Father Silvano Cordelli. In a letter to a colleague later intercepted and archived, he described a series of 14th-century papal bulls stored in a now-defunct abbey in Umbria. Each bore a wax seal bearing the familiar crossed keys, but subtly altered. One key had been replaced with a sword. Cordelli wrote, "The documents concern no dogma, no decree, only inventories. All speak of vessels, fragments, heads. One bears a phrase I have not seen before, custodium per crucem vetustum I guard through the ancient cross." His final note, "These are not bulls, they are instructions." That phrase, the ancient cross, may be the clearest sign yet that some Vatican officials believed themselves to be temporary stewards, not of the Templars, but of what the Templars had held. The altered seals functioned as private indicators, a language of command understood only by those in the loop. And that loop may have been surprisingly wide. Multiple cardinal inventories from the 15th and 16th centuries contain cryptic references to Sigillum Vetus, the Old Seal. Some describe objects in the vaults as marked not with registry numbers, but with those same sigils, crosses, stars, and initials no longer traceable to specific popes. One 1582 ledger lists 2 vessels of undefined purpose marked with red wax of SV. The entry is underlined in faded ink, with the word temporarium possibly indicating temporary custody. The objects are never mentioned again. Even today, Vatican correspondence dealing with sensitive relics is said to bear a unique non-public seal, a simplified version of the crossed keys overlaid with a cross pate devoid of papal name. Only the most senior archivists recognize it. Its use is neither taught nor questioned. But perhaps the most haunting trace of this altered symbolism is etched not in wax but in stone. In a chamber beneath the Apostolic Palace, one not listed on public maps, a keystone arch bears a carving nearly worn smooth. It shows 2 crossed swords, a chalice, and a cross with flared ends. It's not part of any recognized papal motif, but to those who study Templar relics, it's immediately familiar. It's a cipher pointing to a legacy hidden in the very architecture of the Church. The Church never admitted to taking the Templars' sacred objects, but perhaps it didn't have to. The seals did the speaking, quietly, permanently, because a document can be burned, but a mark in wax or stone lasts longer than memory. And sometimes that mark is all that remains of a truth too holy or too heretical to name aloud. They say the Vatican holds more than 50 miles of shelves beneath its marble surface, manuscripts, letters, decrees, maps, and chronicles stretching back to the first whispers of the Christian Empire. But not everything rests on shelves. Some items are sealed, contained, hidden not only behind locked doors, but beneath layers of bureaucracy deliberately unnamed in public records. These items live in a zone few outsiders have ever heard of. It has no official title, but among insiders, it's referred to simply as the Black Vault. It isn't marked on any map of Vatican City. No placard hangs beside the door. And when questions are raised about it during interviews, responses shift into Latin legalese or nervous laughter. But it exists. Evidence of its presence has surfaced sporadically, quietly, in footnotes, personal memoirs, and restricted access logs. And according to several credible accounts, many of the most controversial Templar relics that survived suppression and centuries of relocation have ended up inside its walls. The name Black Vault doesn't come from the color of the space itself, but from its designation in 20th century document tags. In internal clerical indexing, Black class referred to objects considered both theologically sensitive and diplomatically hazardous. That means items whose discovery, if made public, could challenge the Church's legitimacy, alter faith narratives, or provoke diplomatic crises. Some belonged to early Christian sects, others to pre-Christian traditions. But a notable number were flagged as having Ordo Templi provenance. One former Vatican custodian, writing under a pseudonym in 1968, described being assigned to clean a lower archive vault for a high-ranking cardinal. He was told to touch nothing and speak to no one, but during his duties, he noticed several storage cases marked with a symbol he did not recognize, a stylized T set within a circular sunburst. Years later, while researching the Templars, he found a near-identical image carved into a lintel above the ruins of a former commandery in Provence. He was later dismissed from his post. No reason given. An unusual anomaly surfaces in Vatican access records from 1944. In the final months of World War II, while Allied troops advanced through Italy, a team of clerics and archivists was assembled under direct papal authority to secure relics of unclassified order. The files were sealed, but a margin note lists the retrieval of 4 vessels, 2 marked 2 unknown, and a head-shaped reliquary container exhibiting pre-Tridentine Latin and geometric inlays. The team returned after 10 days and were immediately reassigned to administrative positions. The objects were logged under the internal catalog group BV1307. The number is almost certainly a reference to the year the Templars were arrested. There is no public catalog of BV items, but once in a while the edges of it leak. A 1987 internal Vatican memo uncovered in a series of WikiLeaks-style leaks from an anonymous source in the early 2000s includes an object listed as T. Codex Vellum skin-based ink, heretical metaphysical cosmology, possible link to Eastern Temple ritual. Do not translate. Store BV, perpetual restriction. No images were included. No follow-up noted. Even more chilling is a 2001 report from a visiting Benedictine scholar who, under tightly controlled access, was allowed to study relic containers in the sub-basement of the Apostolic Palace. He described one case, large unmarked, that he was not permitted to open. His Vatican escort referred to it as una cosa del tempo perduto, a thing from lost time. When he inquired further, he was told it came from the Templar transfer. The escort made the sign of the cross and changed the subject. If these accounts are accurate, then the Black Vault doesn't just contain relics. It holds a story. A hidden lineage of sacred objects, some venerated, some feared, that were removed from circulation, not because they were false, but because they were inconvenient. One rumored item, known only through second-hand descriptions, is called the vessel that burns cold. Supposedly, it is a cup-shaped relic, smooth and blackened, which remains ice-cold no matter the surrounding temperature. Templar writings refer to an object with similar properties, said to be used in initiations. The Church has never acknowledged it. But internal logs show a corresponding entry item vessel. Thermal anomaly confirmed, no exposure permitted. Another is the so-called unseen head, a sculpted bust found behind a false wall in a former Templar stronghold. The artifact reportedly causes nausea and disorientation when viewed directly for more than a few seconds. Whether this is psychosomatic or engineered is unknown. Its storage number begins with BV. Why store these objects at all? Why not destroy them? Because knowledge once held becomes responsibility. And relics, even dangerous ones, retain a gravity that makes them nearly impossible to discard. The Church, for all its authority, has always feared the consequences of abandonment. Better to lock the door and forget the key. There is, of course, no public acknowledgement of the Black Vault. Ask an official archivist, and you'll be met with a smile or a shrug. But somewhere in the quiet halls beneath the Vatican, that vault remains, guarded, climate-controlled, forgotten but not unpopulated. Its relics sit in the dark, not dead, just waiting. And if you ever find yourself holding a Vatican relic with no origin, no label, no story, you might have touched something once sealed under a name now erased. Something the Templars tried to keep. Something the Church chose to keep secret. Because some relics aren't for adoration, they're for containment. In the great web of Vatican power, few threads are as quietly influential or as carefully guarded as that of the Society of Jesus. Founded in 1540, the Jesuits have often been described as the intellectual arm of the Church, the shadow diplomats of faith, and occasionally its most cunning historians. But buried within that legacy is a lesser-known role, that of relic custodian. And if the whispers are to be believed, the Jesuits didn't just safeguard standard Church artifacts, they inherited a legacy far older. A relic lineage traced not to Peter, but to the Temple. It begins with a peculiar set of letters exchanged in the late 17th century between Jesuit scholars stationed in Avignon and Rome. The letters discuss the recovery and concealment of anomalous items from suppressed French monastery sites that notably had once belonged to the Templars. One letter refers obliquely to objects best left to the society, for they speak more to structure than symbol. That phrase, more to structure than symbol, appears again a century later in a marginal note found in the Jesuit reductions of Paraguay, where missionaries recorded encounters with tribal artifacts resembling medieval Christian symbols, some strikingly similar to the solar cross patterns of the Temple Brethren. Officially, the Jesuits deny any special custodianship over relics. Their mission, as stated, is to educate, evangelize, and serve. Yet across Jesuit colleges, archives, and private chapels, one finds an oddly consistent presence of iconography linked to Templar traditions, not overt, never named, but recognizable to the trained eye. The eight-pointed star, the double-barred cross, the chalice encircled by thorns, symbols that drifted into disuse elsewhere, but found quiet shelter in Jesuit texts. One controversial theory, proposed by a now defrocked historian from Salamanca, suggests that during the suppression of the Jesuits in the 18th century, a cache of relics was quietly smuggled from the Gesù in Rome into private villas along the Tyrrhenian coast. These relics were not catalogued among the Church's main inventory, but bore inscriptions traced to confiscated Templar logs. Among them was a relic described as an ark of cedar bound in bronze with hidden seals. The Church labeled this as legend. Yet during restoration work in 1973, an artifact matching that description was discovered beneath the Jesuit chapel in Naples. It was quickly removed. No public record was released. The team involved was reassigned within days. What lends weight to the theory is the peculiar behavior of certain Jesuit scholars throughout history. Matteo Ricci, the famed missionary to China, carried with him a set of relics deemed unsuitable for general devotion. In his private notes, he described one item as having origin not of east nor west, but of a hidden path once guarded by men of the sword. He never elaborated. The item was never found among his belongings when he died. It disappeared, or perhaps returned. In 1947, following the chaos of World War II, the Vatican established a special commission to reevaluate the status of relics that had gone missing, been displaced, or resurfaced in unusual contexts. Internal minutes from this commission, leaked decades later, mention a brief but striking observation. The Jesuit registry maintains parallel lists of devotional items, many unaccounted for, in our central catalog. A cardinal noted that these items should be reintegrated or reclassified. But the subject was dropped after that meeting. The parallel registry was never discussed again. A darker story emerged in the early 1990s when a former archivist from the Pontifical Gregorian University, a Jesuit institution, claimed to have seen a reliquary sealed in lead and bound with leather straps bearing inscriptions in Aramaic and a variant of Old French. It was labeled simply Obscura 1309. The archivist attempted to photograph it. The camera failed. When he returned, the object was gone. The strongest evidence of Jesuit custodianship may lie in the pattern of locations where lost Templar relics have reportedly resurfaced. In South America, during excavations of Jesuit mission sites, researchers have found reliquary components made from European materials unknown in the region. One, a small carved disc, bore markings nearly identical to Templar seals found in northern France. In India, a Jesuit seminary held a chalice of unusual composition, one not matching any local tradition. When tested, its alloy was dated to the 13th century and bore faint traces of a red wax seal beneath its base. None of these items were ever publicly connected to the Templars. But taken together, they suggest an informal continuity, a chain of guardianship preserved not by decree, but by discretion. It's a strange symmetry. The Templars accused of heresy guarded relics they deemed too sacred for ordinary eyes. The Jesuits once outlawed appear to have followed suit. But where the Templars defended through fortresses and swords, the Jesuits defended through knowledge, secrecy, and network. They didn't fight to keep the relics safe. They simply made sure no one could find them. And perhaps the strangest twist is this: in several cases, Jesuit records refer to these objects not as relics, but as keys. Not keys to chests, nor to doors, but to understandings. To layers of the faith not revealed, but encoded. The Church speaks of mystery as revelation delayed. The Jesuits, it seems, preserved mystery as truth disguised. If this is true, then the relics taken from the Templars didn't vanish into darkness. They were handed from one secretive hand to another. And in the quiet rooms of Jesuit libraries, in the ink-stained margins of forbidden texts, the memory of the Templar relics and their meaning lives on, hidden, not forgotten. It began with a whisper, a strange stain on linen reported in the archives of a rural church outside Perugia in 1906. The local priest believed the cloth to be centuries old, kept in a reliquary passed down through an unknown benefactor. During a spring service, a child touched the case and withdrew her hand in pain. Moments later, a drop of crimson appeared on the glass. The priest called it a miracle. The diocese called for silence. The relic was removed by Vatican officials within the week, never to be displayed again. But what made the event truly curious was the notation added to the parish record afterward, transferred to Jesuit care, probable origin temple inventory, 1308. Over the next century, the pattern repeated. Isolated incidents across Europe, Latin America, and even Asia, all involving mysterious relics that appeared to emit inexplicable phenomena. Some bled, some wept, some glowed faintly under no known source of light. None were officially acknowledged by the Church. But in each case, a quiet Vatican intervention followed, and the artifacts were sealed, stored, or erased from public record. Among the most striking cases was that of the Veil of Langres. In 1929, a small Benedictine convent reported a strange phenomenon. A square of embroidered fabric reportedly acquired from a private collector began to emit a metallic scent and grew noticeably damp on its underside every Easter morning. When one nun attempted to soak up the moisture, she described it as thick and warm like blood, she whispered. The local bishop requested a Vatican review. What arrived instead were two plain-clothed officials who took the relic under a preservation protocol. The collector, when questioned, claimed the cloth had come from a knightly order lost to time. His records were burned in a fire shortly after. He disappeared the following winter. Then came the Aix chalice incident. In 1957, in a quiet corner of southern France, a local priest held a private mass using a medieval chalice donated by a collector whose family traced back to Templar lines. During the rite, multiple witnesses observed the wine rise slightly in the cup, as if repelled by something unseen, then sink again, leaving behind 3 crimson rings along the inner rim. One altar boy fainted. The priest recorded the incident in a personal journal. That journal was later found inside the Jesuit college in Lyon, sealed within a folio marked anomalous. The chalice was never located. Skeptics argue these are exaggerations, folklore, or well-intentioned misinterpretations of natural phenomena. And yet Vatican internal correspondence smuggled to the public during a brief archival breach in 2002 suggests otherwise. In one report labeled Phenomena of Type R, a series of object files were reviewed for their recurring physical anomalies. Item R17 was described as a carved stone fragment elliptical bearing sigils consistent with Templar inscriptions. When exposed to low humidity, it emits a thin line of fluid. Origin recovered from Jesuit property in Galicia. Disposition black vault. Another entry, R23, was a sealed ampule found within a ruined reliquary, still viscous, exact contents unknown. Matches 1310 inventory from Avignon. These weren't just oddities, they were catalogued, monitored, hidden. Some theologians have quietly proposed a theory that these relics weren't miraculous in the traditional sense, but rather the products of forgotten rites. If the Templars had discovered or inherited sacred traditions older than Rome itself, perhaps these items were never meant to be venerated, but used in ceremonies no longer understood or no longer permitted. In that light, the relic's reactions might not be divine at all, but alchemical or ritualistic. One 13th century Templar document recovered in Cyprus hints at instruments of the veiled rite which respond to the faithful, not with words, but with signs of the living matter. The Vatican has never commented on the document. In 1972, a retired cardinal speaking off record to an Italian journalist confessed that in his youth he had been taken deep below the apostolic palace to witness a display of wonders reserved only for the most trusted. Among the items was a cruciform artifact that beat faintly like a bird trapped in stone. He asked its origin. The response was a single word: temple. Not all relics that bleed are punished for doing so, but those that defy classification, that refuse to fit within doctrine, are usually sealed, silenced, and forgotten. The Vatican has no place in its liturgy for a reliquary that pulses or a fragment of cloth that stains itself with blood no one can trace. And yet, they keep appearing. Each century seems to bring a new sighting. A reliquary lost a statue that drips across, that burns without flame. And in each case, the same conclusion: not a miracle, not a fraud, but something in between. Something deeply inconvenient. Something that reminds the Church that not all sacred things are safe, and not all truths are ready for the light. In the quiet rooms where Vatican curators gather, there is a phrase passed between them, never officially recorded, always spoken in whispers: the relics are not dead. They remember. And perhaps somewhere in the crypts and vaults below, wrapped in linen and silence, the memory of the Templars still stirs. It was in the margins that the truth began to leak, not in the thunder of papal decrees or the splendor of cathedrals, but in the quiet cracks between Vatican protocol and human conscience. For centuries, those within the Holy See who suspected the truth said nothing. Silence, after all, is a form of loyalty. But now and then, one voice breaks the spell. The earliest trace of dissent comes from a curious entry in a private journal belonging to Monsignor Giuseppe Conti, dated 1807. Buried in pages otherwise filled with liturgical notes and minor administrative matters is a line that stands out: "The reliquary with the serpent-bound seal was shown to me tonight." It matches the illustration from the temple scrolls. I am told to forget what I've seen. But how does one forget a relic that bleeds? Conti never wrote of it again. He died quietly, and his journal was found decades later in a seminary library, mislabeled under theological reflections. But his mention of the serpent-bound seal would be echoed more than a century later. In 1934, a young archivist named Father Miguel Serrano, working deep in the Vatican Apostolic Archive, reportedly stumbled upon a sealed inventory labeled Inventarium Sanguinis, listing items seized during the Templar suppression and relocated under papal authorization. Serrano, disturbed by the implications, attempted to raise questions to his superior. By week's end, he had been reassigned to a rural post in Chile. His letters to colleagues changed in tone afterward, careful, distant. But one final note, hidden in the binding of a book he sent home to his sister, read, "They guard what was not meant to be guarded. It is not the heresy they fear, but the truth beneath it." These aren't just stories of institutional retaliation. They are stories of internal crisis of individuals who, standing too close to the concealed past, could no longer pretend the surface was all that mattered. In the 1960s, during a wave of modernization within the Church, a group of mid-level curial officials proposed a limited relics transparency review, hoping to reconcile inconsistencies between historical relic inventories and known holdings. One of the group's members, a Jesuit named Father Dario Andreotti, gave a private interview years later, stating, "The problem wasn't what we lacked. It was what we had, but were told not to ask about." There are things in that vault that predate even Constantine's conversion. What truly shifted the conversation, however, was a photo. In 1983, a blurry image surfaced among fringe Catholic circles, a grainy shot taken within the Vatican Museum's sub-basement, showing what appeared to be a large reliquary case labeled Templi Confiscati, flanked by papal guards. The image, reportedly taken by a technician during climate control repairs, was dismissed as a forgery. But subsequent analysis showed the labeling style and uniforms matched the correct era, and most curiously, the inscription font was in a style not used since the 17th century. The technician who leaked the image, untraceable. No employment records. No family. Gone. Then came Sister Beatrice. In 1999, a cloistered nun from a Carmelite convent in Austria sent a sealed letter to an investigative historian, claiming she had seen a silver head wrapped in crimson cloth, eyes closed, mouth open, as if whispering during her pilgrimage to Rome as a novice. She'd been part of a small group shown rare devotional items by a priest who forgot which room was off limits. She was told afterward that she had seen a martyr's effigy, but in her words, it felt too alive. She spent the rest of her life in quiet seclusion, never renouncing her faith, but always believing the Church hides what it cannot explain. More recently, a 2017 audio recording surfaced, a voice said to belong to a former Vatican security officer who, in his retirement, shared fragments of his time escorting visiting cardinals through the Archivum Obscurum. In the tape, he describes passing through a chamber lined with objects under cloth, each marked with a symbol I was never taught. One relic he described as a scepter made of bone carved with words I could not read, warm to the touch. His conclusion was simple, tired, they have it all. The Templar things, the old things, and they don't destroy them, they're still trying to understand them. This brings us to the reliquary that has not been publicly seen since 1314, the so-called Thorned Cross of Montségur. Templar records referenced it once as an object recovered from Cathar ruins and transported to Paris shortly before the arrests. Then the trail vanished. But in 2022, an anonymous source leaked a Vatican logistics memo to an independent researcher. It listed items scheduled for high-security internal transfer. One line read simply, XM 1314R1, Montségur. No explanation, no category, just a name not spoken aloud for 700 years. What these whistleblowers reveal is not a vast conspiracy, but a quiet, relentless, curatorial instinct. The Church as an institution preserves. It records. It reframes. And when necessary, it buries. The relics taken from the Templars were never paraded. They were placed in the hands of keepers who understood silence better than spectacle. Some whisper not to reveal secrets, but to unburden themselves. A confession not of sin, but of awe. These voices scattered across centuries offer a glimpse of what still stirs behind the Basilica walls. A reliquary unopened, a head that bleeds, a whisper in the dark saying we never gave it back. You've followed the threads winding through arrests and interrogations, inventories that vanished, convoys that never reached their destination, reliquaries sealed in darkness, and priests who whispered of things they should not have seen. Now the pattern begins to reveal itself. The Vatican's relationship with the Knights Templar was never simply one of discipline or doctrinal purity. It was acquisition of symbols of silence and of something far stranger. Step by step, the Church absorbed the legacy of the Temple, not by honoring it, but by folding it into its own foundations. When the fires died and the last Grand Master's voice was swallowed by smoke, what survived wasn't ash, but artifacts. Relics too potent to be destroyed, yet too dangerous to be acknowledged. Consider what you've seen in the night of mass arrests, followed by targeted seizures. A papal betrayal disguised as piety. Treasure lists and passion relics hidden beneath official records. Even the Turin shroud, hailed now as a sacred relic, may have passed through Templar hands before re-emerging in church custody centuries later. Its trail, like so many others, traces a line straight to Avignon, to the vaults built not to preserve, but to possess. The Vatican's curators didn't merely store these objects, they rebranded them. Relics once guarded by sword and oath were renamed, reframed, and placed under the watchful gaze of institutions that had condemned their original keepers. A chalice thought to hold sacred blood became just another cup from an unremarkable saint. A severed head once invoked in whispers as a source of wisdom became a heretical footnote in the index. Even architectural records suggest absorption, an underground chamber constructed in the wake of the dissolution bearing symbols too similar to Templar iconography to be coincidence. In its cold recesses, inscriptions speak not of condemnation, but continuity. And in the Black Vault, itemized under new classification systems, rest the artifacts once marked Templi Confiscati. This is not a case of simple suppression. It is a carefully managed erasure. The relics themselves may still exist, stone, bone cloth, and chalice, but stripped of their story, disconnected from the hands that once bled for them. Their power is not just in their matter, but in what they once meant. The Vatican didn't destroy the Templar legacy. It rewrote it. That legacy bleeds through in modern symbols, papal seals echoing Templar geometry, Jesuit custodians protecting items far older than their own order, and relics that refuse to die quietly. The whispers from within the Church, from nuns, archivists, and cardinals long buried, all speak of objects that react, breathe, pulse. These are not stories of the past. They are symptoms of something ongoing. If the relics remain, and all signs suggest they do, then so too does the mystery. Because with each confession, each leaked memo, and each hidden reliquary comes the same question: why keep them? Why guard what has no official place in doctrine, no mention in catechism? Unless, of course, there is something still being protected, not from the world, but from the world's understanding. What the Church took from the Templars was never just gold or parchment. It was the final say in what would be remembered and what would be locked behind stone. But stone wears down, vaults shift, and secrets, no matter how deeply buried, have a tendency to rise again. And now, just as in 1312 the question lingers, is the Church still the custodian of sacred truth, or simply its last jailer? And now, in this quiet hour, we descend once more, not into fire or judgment, but into stillness. The questions have been asked, the shadows have stretched, and beneath the great dome of St. Peter's, something ancient waits in the silence. Imagine the world slipping into slumber. Rome at dusk, its golden lights trembling on cobbled streets. Pilgrims whisper their prayers beside fountains. A bell chimes not in alarm, but in remembrance. The Basilica rises like a stone memory, but below its marble skin lies another world. Stone gives way to soil. Hallways become tunnels. Air grows cool, heavy with the scent of candle smoke and centuries. There are places where footsteps have not echoed in generations. Places lit only by the hush of memory. Somewhere in that depth beyond the tourist catacombs and documented tombs, there may lie a door without a name. It does not appear on maps. It does not carry the papal seal. Its hinges are rusted, its frame older than the floor that surrounds it. And behind that door, a chamber modest, unmarked, but impossibly old. Inside, a reliquary rests upon a slab. No inscription, no velvet, no crown. Just a shape under cloth breathing history. A shiver of metal beneath linen. The air seems still but charged. Not with fear, but with knowing. No guards, no priests, just presence. Here time forgets itself. The Vatican above pulses with ritual and song. But this place does not echo. It absorbs. Perhaps the Church does not hide out of malice. Perhaps in some quiet part of itself, it understands that not all relics were meant to be worshipped, that some are meant to be endured. And so they are left in peace. You feel it now, don't you? That weight of secrecy, not heavy, but holy. The sense that something has been preserved not to deceive, but to wait. For what, for whom, maybe for you. Because history does not end in revelation. It ends in rest. And beneath this basilica, beneath all the noise of power and empire, the relics still sleep, dreaming of nights of oaths, of fire, and of faith. Sleep well, pilgrim. The truth is still here.